March 15, 1943, 11:47 p.m. Leningrad Military Hospital, number 442, Soviet Union. Dr. Mikhail Petrov carefully closed the supply closet door behind him, his hands trembling slightly as he held a small bundle of medical supplies. The smell of disinfectant and coal smoke filled the dimly lit corridor, mixing with the distant sound of artillery shells falling on the besieged city. At 43 years old, this veteran surgeon had saved countless Red Army soldiers during the brutal 872-day siege. But tonight, he was about to make a decision that would either save a life or destroy his own. Hidden in the basement storage room, barely conscious and burning with fever, lay Obergefreiter Hans Müller, a 20-year-old German Wehrmacht soldier who had been captured 3 days earlier during a failed reconnaissance mission near the Neva River. What Dr. Petrov didn't know was that Commissar Viktor Kozlov had been watching him for weeks, documenting every unusual movement, every unexplained absence from his rounds. The mathematics of survival in Stalin's Soviet Union were brutal and simple. Helping the enemy meant death. But letting a patient die went against everything Petrov had sworn as a physician. The siege of Leningrad had been raging for over a year, turning one of the Soviet Union's most beautiful cities into a frozen hellscape of starvation and death. Over 640 Zauzuzeran civilians had already perished from hunger, cold, and constant bombardment, while the city's defenders held their positions with desperate determination. The Leningrad Front, commanded by Marshal Leonid Govorov, faced Army Group North under Field Marshal Georg von Küchler, creating a static front line that stretched across the frozen marshlands south of the city. Medical supplies were critically short, with hospitals operating on bare minimum rations of morphine, sulfa drugs, and surgical equipment. Dr. Petrov had been working 18-hour shifts since the siege began, treating everything from shrapnel wounds to severe malnutrition cases among both military personnel and civilians. His hospital, originally designed for 300 patients, now housed over 800 wounded soldiers crammed into every available space, including converted classrooms and storage areas. The official policy regarding enemy prisoners was clear and uncompromising. Wounded German soldiers were to receive basic medical care sufficient to keep them alive for interrogation by NKVD officers, nothing more. Any physician found providing preferential treatment or attempting to hide enemy personnel faced immediate arrest and execution for treason against the Soviet state. Hans Müller had been found unconscious in a shell crater by a Red Army patrol, his left leg mangled by shrapnel, and his body temperature dangerously low from exposure to the -30-degree cold. When the stretcher bearers brought him to hospital number 442, Dr. Petrov was the attending physician on duty in the emergency treatment area. One look at the young German's injuries told him the boy would die within hours without immediate surgical intervention. The femoral artery was severed, infection was already setting into the wound, and signs of severe hypothermia indicated organ failure was imminent. Standard protocol demanded that Petrov stabilize the prisoner and transfer him to the special ward for enemy personnel, where NKVD interrogators would extract whatever information they could before allowing nature to take its course. But something about the unconscious soldier triggered a memory that Petrov had tried to suppress for months. 6 weeks earlier, his own son, Alexei, a 19-year-old tank gunner with the 23rd Tank Corps, had been reported missing in action during the failed offensive at Mega Station. According to his commanding officer's letter, Alexei's T-34 had been hit by German anti-tank fire and caught fire, but his body was never recovered from the battlefield. Looking down at Hans Müller's pale, boyish face, Petrov saw his own son lying wounded in some German field hospital, perhaps dying alone and far from home, while enemy doctors debated whether a Russian boy deserved their limited medical supplies. The decision to hide Müller came suddenly and without conscious planning. As the stretcher bearers prepared to move the German to the prisoner ward, Petrov quietly redirected them to a storage room in the hospital's basement, telling them he needed to perform emergency surgery immediately to prevent the prisoner from bleeding to death before interrogation. Once alone with the unconscious soldier, Petrov worked quickly to clean and suture the damaged artery, administered precious sulfa powder to combat infection, and started an IV drip using saline solution meant for Soviet soldiers. He told the hospital administrator that the German prisoner had died during surgery and that the body had been removed for disposal, forging the necessary paperwork to make the death appear official. For the next 3 days, Petrov used his position as senior surgeon to access the storage room during his normal rounds, bringing food, medical supplies, and checking on Muller's condition as the young soldier slowly regained consciousness. The deception required careful timing and constant vigilance. Petrov had to maintain his normal surgical schedule while secretly treating his hidden patient, stealing supplies from the hospital's dwindling reserves without arousing suspicion from nursing staff or administrative personnel. If you want to discover how a single act of humanity in wartime can either redeem a man's soul or destroy his life completely, please leave your like on this video. This helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss the next episodes. We rescue stories like this from dusty archives every single day. What Dr. Petrov didn't realize was that Commissar Viktor Kozlov, the hospital's assigned political officer, had been conducting routine surveillance of medical staff since arriving 2 months earlier. Stalin's paranoia about potential traitors and saboteurs within the medical corps had intensified, following several documented cases of physicians allegedly showing sympathy toward enemy prisoners or expressing defeatist attitudes about the war. Kozlov's mission was to identify and eliminate any medical personnel whose loyalty to the Soviet state might be compromised by bourgeois humanitarian sentiments or religious beliefs about the sanctity of human life. A former mathematics teacher from Tula, who had joined the Communist Party in 1938, Kozlov approached his duties with methodical precision, maintaining detailed logs of every physician's daily activities, conversations with colleagues, and behavior patterns during high-stress situations. His reports to NKVD headquarters in Moscow documented everything from casual remarks about food shortages to expressions of concern for German civilians caught in the crossfire of urban combat. According to Kozlov's files, Dr. Petrov had displayed several warning signs of potential ideological deviation. He had been observed praying quietly over deceased patients, had questioned the medical rationale behind certain treatment protocols for enemy prisoners, and had been seen reading letters from home during duty hours when he should have been focused entirely on serving the Soviet war effort. On the evening of March 13th, Kozlov had noticed Dr. Petrov making an unusual number of trips to the hospital's basement storage areas, carrying medical supplies that didn't appear in the official distribution logs. Following at a discreet distance, the commissar observed Petrov entering a locked storage room and remaining inside for nearly 20 minutes before emerging empty-handed and returning to his normal rounds. The next evening, Kozlov positioned himself in a maintenance corridor where he could observe the storage room entrance without being detected. Through a crack in the door, he witnessed Dr. Petrov changing bandages on what appeared to be a wounded man lying on an improvised stretcher between stacks of medical supplies. Although he couldn't clearly see the patient's face or uniform, Kozlov's training in surveillance techniques allowed him to document the time, duration, and nature of the medical treatment being provided. Most damning of all was his observation of Dr. Petrov speaking to the patient in broken German, clearly communicating with someone who was not a Soviet citizen or ally. Armed with this evidence, Kozlov began planning the arrest that would not only expose Dr. Petrov's treasonous activities but also serve as an example to other medical personnel who might harbor similar humanitarian delusions about treating the enemy with anything more than the minimum care required for intelligence extraction. Hans Müller regained full consciousness on the morning of March 16th, waking to find himself lying on a makeshift bed in what appeared to be a storage room, filled with medical supplies and equipment. The last thing he remembered clearly was the devastating artillery barrage that had killed his patrol leader and left him crawling through frozen mud while Soviet infantry closed in on their position. Now, looking down at his professionally bandaged leg and the IV tube running into his arm, He realized he was receiving medical care that far exceeded anything he had expected as a prisoner of war. When Dr. Petrov arrived for his morning check, Muller attempted to speak in his limited Russian, but the physician quickly switched to the broken German he had learned during his medical studies in Vienna before the revolution. Through halting conversation, Petrov learned that Muller was a conscripted soldier from a small farming village near Dresden, the youngest of 4 brothers who had all been drafted into Wehrmacht service. Like thousands of German boys his age, Hans had never wanted to be a soldier and had written letters to his mother expressing hope that the war would end before he saw combat. His unit, the 58th Infantry Division, had been transferred to the Leningrad sector after suffering heavy casualties during the previous winter's fighting near Moscow, filled with replacement troops who had received minimal training before being shipped to the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. During their brief conversations, Dr. Petrov found himself drawn into discussions about medicine, family, and the absurd tragedy of young men killing each other over the political ambitions of distant leaders they had never met. Muller spoke about his interrupted studies in agricultural sciences and his dream of returning home to help modernize his family's farm, while Petrov shared memories of his son Alexei's passion for engineering and his plans to study at Moscow Technical Institute after the war. These conversations, conducted in whispered tones during Petrov's stolen moments away from his official duties, created a dangerous bond between the Russian doctor and his hidden German patient. Both men understood the enormous risk they were taking. Muller's very existence in the storage room meant certain death for both of them if discovered, while Petrov's medical assistance constituted treason against the Soviet state punishable by immediate execution. Yet neither man could bring himself to end the charade that had become a small island of humanity in an ocean of mechanized violence and ideological hatred. Their shared medical knowledge created a common language that transcended nationalism, while their mutual concern for family members caught in the war's machinery formed an emotional connection that made betrayal unthinkable. Have any of you ever met someone from the opposite side of a conflict who made you question everything you thought you knew about enemies and friends? Leave a comment right now saying simply, "Humanity transcends war." When you comment, you're not just sharing a thought. You're preserving the memory of those who chose compassion over safety in history's darkest moments. Let's create a living memorial here in the comments. By March 18th, Commissar Kozlov had gathered sufficient evidence to proceed with arrests, but his methodical nature demanded absolute certainty before taking action that would irreversibly damage or destroy the hospital's senior surgical staff. Medical personnel were in critically short supply throughout the Leningrad front, and executing a skilled surgeon required approval from higher authorities, who would demand irrefutable proof of treason. Kozlov's surveillance had documented Dr. Petrov's suspicious behavior, but he still needed to identify the individual receiving treatment and confirm that treasonous aid was being provided to an enemy combatant rather than some authorized medical activity. On the evening of March 18th, Kozlov recruited 2 reliable NKVD operatives from the local security apparatus and positioned them at strategic points around the hospital's basement level. When Dr. Petrov made his usual evening visit to the storage room, the team would simultaneously surround the area and gather the evidence needed for formal charges. The plan was simple and methodical. Document the treasonous activity with multiple witnesses, arrest both the doctor and his patient, and conduct immediate interrogations to determine whether other hospital personnel were involved in the conspiracy against Soviet state interests. At 10:15 p.m., Dr. Petrov completed his final surgical procedure of the day, a complex operation to remove shrapnel from a tank commander's chest cavity. Exhausted from another 18-hour shift, he gathered medical supplies for what he intended to be a final check on Hans Müller's condition before attempting to arrange the German soldier's escape from the hospital. Over the past 5 days, Müller's leg wound had healed sufficiently to allow limited mobility, and both men knew that continued concealment was becoming increasingly dangerous for everyone involved. Petrov had devised a plan to provide Müller with civilian clothing and false documentation that would allow him to blend in with the thousands of refugees moving through Leningrad's shattered suburbs. eventually making his way to German lines during the chaos of the next major offensive. As he descended the staircase leading to the basement storage areas, Petrov felt the weight of exhaustion, moral uncertainty, and growing paranoia about discovery by hospital administrators who seemed increasingly suspicious of his activities. The smell of coal smoke and disinfectant seemed stronger than usual in the narrow corridor, mixing with his own sweat and the metallic taste of fear that had become constant since beginning this dangerous deception. When Dr. Petrov opened the storage room door, he found Hans Müller sitting up on his makeshift bed, attempting to change his own bandages with supplies Petrov had left during the previous evening's visit. The young German soldier looked up with a mixture of gratitude and concern, immediately sensing the tension and exhaustion in his protector's demeanor. Before either man could speak, the storage room was suddenly flooded with harsh electric light, as Commissar Kozlov and his NKVD operatives burst through the door with weapons drawn. The scene was exactly what Kozlov had expected to find: a Soviet physician providing medical care to a German prisoner who was being concealed from proper authorities and interrogation procedures. Dr. Petrov's face went pale as he realized the full implications of being discovered, while Hans Müller instinctively raised his hands in surrender, understanding that his protector's act of kindness had just become a death sentence for both of them. Kozlov's voice was calm and methodical as he placed both men under arrest for treason against the Soviet state, documenting the scene with photographs and detailed notes that would serve as evidence in their inevitable military tribunal and execution. The interrogation of Dr. Mikhail Petrov began immediately in the hospital's administrative office, now converted into a temporary NKVD holding facility. Under harsh electric lights that had been requisitioned from operating theaters, Commissar Kozlov methodically questioned the physician about his motivations, accomplices, and long-term plans for the hidden German prisoner. Petrov's responses were carefully recorded by a stenographer brought in from NKVD headquarters, creating an official transcript that would be forwarded to Moscow for review by Stalin's security apparatus. When asked to explain his treasonous behavior, Dr. Petrov spoke quietly about medical ethics, the Hippocratic Oath, and his inability to watch a young man die when simple medical intervention could save his life. Kozlov's response was swift and uncompromising. Soviet physicians served the state first and individual patients second, with clear priorities that placed enemy combatants at the bottom of any medical triage system. According to official Soviet medical doctrine, treating German soldiers beyond the minimum required for intelligence extraction constituted theft of resources meant for Red Army personnel and civilian casualties of fascist aggression. Dr. Petrov's religious references to universal human dignity and medical responsibility were noted as evidence of bourgeois ideological contamination that made him unsuitable for continued service in the Soviet medical establishment. Hans Müller's interrogation focused primarily on intelligence gathering about German military positions, unit strengths, and planned offensive operations around Leningrad. Despite his junior rank and limited access to strategic information, NKVD interrogators employed standard techniques designed to extract every possible detail about Wehrmacht capabilities and intentions. Müller's cooperation was grudging but complete. He understood that providing accurate information might save Dr. Petrov from execution, even though his own fate was already sealed as an enemy combatant caught behind Soviet lines. The intelligence he provided included detailed information about German defensive positions along the Neva River, the location of artillery batteries that had been shelling Soviet positions, and the morale problems affecting Wehrmacht units filled with reluctant conscripts and poorly trained replacements. Most valuable of all was his information about supply shortages plaguing German forces, including critical shortages of winter equipment, medical supplies, and ammunition that suggested Army Group North was in worse condition than Soviet intelligence had previously estimated. This information was immediately forwarded to Red Army commanders planning the next phase of operations, aimed at breaking the siege and driving German forces away from Leningrad's perimeter. Within 48 hours of their arrest, both Dr. Petrov and Hans Müller had been processed through the military justice system with efficiency, that reflected Stalin's emphasis on swift punishment for treasonous activities. Dr. Petrov was stripped of his medical license, expelled from the Communist Party, and sentenced to execution by firing squad for providing aid and comfort to enemies of the Soviet state. The verdict specifically noted that his actions had deprived Red Army soldiers of medical supplies and attention, directly contributing to Soviet casualties that could have been prevented with proper medical prioritization. Hans Müller, as an enemy combatant found in unauthorized hiding, was sentenced to immediate execution without the formality of a military tribunal. Both sentences were scheduled for implementation on March 23, 1943, exactly 1 week after Commissar Kozlov's discovery of the hidden German soldier in Hospital No. 442's storage room. The speed of the legal proceedings reflected standard Soviet practice during wartime. Suspected traitors and enemy personnel required swift elimination to prevent their stories from spreading among other medical personnel who might harbor similar humanitarian delusions about treating German prisoners. But on the morning of March 22nd, just hours before the scheduled executions, an unexpected intervention altered the fate of both condemned men. General Leonid Govorov, commander of the Leningrad Front, had reviewed the intelligence provided by Hans Müller and determined that the German prisoner possessed additional information of strategic value that had not been fully extracted during initial interrogation. More importantly, Govorov had learned about Dr. Petrov's exceptional surgical skills and his successful treatment of hundreds of Red Army soldiers during the siege's most critical periods. Facing an upcoming offensive operation that would generate massive casualties requiring immediate surgical intervention, the general made a calculated decision that prioritized military necessity over political orthodoxy. He commuted Dr. Petrov's death sentence to 10 years in a Siberian labor camp, contingent on the physician's agreement to serve as a frontline surgeon during the coming offensive operations. Hans Müller's execution was postponed indefinitely, while intelligence officers continued extracting information about German defensive positions and operational plans around Leningrad. The story of Dr. Petrov's clemency spread quickly through Hospital No. 442 and other medical facilities throughout the Leningrad front, creating complex reactions among physicians who had witnessed the entire drama unfold. Some medical personnel interpreted the commutation as evidence that skilled professionals were too valuable to waste on ideological purity, while others saw it as a dangerous precedent that might encourage similar acts of sympathy toward enemy prisoners. Commissar Kozlov, whose efficient investigation had uncovered the treason, found his authority diminished by General Govorov's intervention and was quietly transferred to an administrative position in the rear areas where his political reliability would be less critical to immediate military operations. The hospital's medical staff learned to compartmentalize their humanitarian instincts more carefully, understanding that survival in Stalin's system required absolute compliance with official policies, regardless of personal medical ethics or religious beliefs about human dignity. Dr. Petrov's case became a cautionary tale that circulated through military medical establishments throughout the Eastern Front, serving as both warning and inspiration for physicians facing similar moral dilemmas during the war's remaining years. Dr. Mikhail Petrov survived his commuted sentence and continued serving as a military surgeon throughout the siege's final months and the subsequent offensive operations that finally broke German resistance around Leningrad. His surgical skills proved invaluable during the January 1944 offensive that permanently lifted the siege, and his treatment of hundreds of wounded soldiers earned grudging respect from military commanders who gradually overlooked his political unreliability in favor of his medical competence. After the war ended, Petrov served his reduced sentence at a labor camp in the Kolyma region, where his medical skills made him a valuable asset for camp administration dealing with prisoner health issues and mining accidents. He was released in 1950 and permitted to resume civilian medical practice in a small town outside Leningrad, where he worked as a general practitioner until his retirement in 1965. Despite his conviction for treason, local residents respected Dr. Petrov's dedication to healing and his willingness to treat any patient regardless of their ability to pay or political background. He never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences or the moral dilemmas that had nearly cost him his life, maintaining the discretion that had become second nature during Stalin's era of political paranoia and ideological persecution. Hans Müller's fate was more complicated and ultimately tragic, reflecting the broader complexities of prisoner treatment during the Eastern Front's brutal warfare. Although his execution was postponed, he remained in Soviet custody throughout the war's duration, providing intelligence about German military operations while serving as a translator and interpreter for interrogation teams processing other Wehrmacht prisoners. His cooperation with Soviet intelligence officers was noted favorably in official records, but his status as an enemy combatant made repatriation impossible until after Germany's surrender in May 1945. Unfortunately, Hans Müller never lived to see peace return to Europe. He died of pneumonia in a Soviet prisoner camp near Vorkuta in February 1945, just 3 months before the war's end. His death was officially recorded as resulting from natural causes, but fellow prisoners later reported that inadequate medical care and harsh living conditions had contributed to his deteriorating health during the final winter of the conflict. Dr. Petrov never learned about Müller's death until decades after the war, when he encountered a former German prisoner who had known the young soldier during their captivity together in the Vorkuta camp system. The broader impact of Dr. Petrov's case extended far beyond the individuals directly involved, influencing Soviet military medical policies and professional training programs throughout the war's final phases. Military medical schools began emphasizing political reliability alongside clinical competence, requiring physicians to undergo ideological training that reinforced their primary loyalty to the Soviet state rather than abstract humanitarian principles. The case also contributed to increased surveillance of medical personnel in frontline hospitals, with political officers like Commissar Kozlov becoming permanent fixtures in military medical establishments, where they monitored physician behavior and reported any signs of ideological deviation or sympathy toward enemy personnel. These changes reflected Stalin's broader paranoia about potential traitors within professional classes, who might place international humanitarian standards above Soviet national interests, a concern that intensified as the war progressed, and contact with Western allies increased opportunities for ideological contamination among Soviet citizens. In the decades following the war, Dr. Petrov's story became part of the complex narrative surrounding medical ethics. During periods of extreme political and military tension, medical historians studying the Eastern Front have identified hundreds of similar cases where physicians faced impossible choices between professional medical obligations and political survival in totalitarian systems that demanded absolute ideological conformity. These cases illustrate the fundamental tension between universal humanitarian principles embedded in medical training and the particular demands of national loyalty during wartime, when treating enemy personnel could be interpreted as treason against one's own country and fellow citizens. Dr. Petrov's decision to hide and treat Hans Müller represents a moment when individual conscience overcame systemic political pressure, demonstrating both the power and the ultimate limitations of personal moral choice in the face of overwhelming institutional authority backed by lethal force. The preservation of this story depends on understanding its broader significance as a testament to the complexity of human behavior during extreme circumstances, when ordinary people must choose between competing moral systems that each claim absolute authority over individual conscience. Dr. Petrov's willingness to risk his life for the principle that medical care transcends national boundaries reflects values that continue to resonate in modern discussions about humanitarian obligations during armed conflicts, refugee crises, and other situations where political authorities demand loyalty that conflicts with professional ethical standards. His case demonstrates that even in the most oppressive political systems, individuals retain the capacity for moral choice and the ability to affirm human dignity in the face of dehumanizing ideological pressures. The tragedy of both Dr. Petrov and Hans Müller lies not just in their personal suffering, but in the broader reality that political systems designed to promote human welfare can become mechanisms for destroying the very humanitarian impulses that make civilization possible. Modern medical professionals studying this case often focus on its relevance to contemporary debates about physicians' responsibilities during armed conflicts, particularly regarding the treatment of enemy combatants and civilians caught in war zones. International humanitarian law, embodied in the Geneva Conventions and subsequent protocols, now provides clearer legal frameworks for medical neutrality and the protection of healthcare workers who treat all patients regardless of their nationality or political affiliation. However, Dr. Petrov's dilemma remains relevant in situations where international law conflicts with domestic political pressures or where medical professionals face retaliation for treating individuals deemed enemies by their own governments. The case serves as a reminder that legal protections for medical neutrality are only as strong as the political systems that enforce them, and that individual physicians may still face impossible choices between professional obligations and personal survival in politically unstable or authoritarian contexts. The story of Dr. Petrov and Hans Müller ultimately transcends its specific historical context to address fundamental questions about human nature, moral courage, and the possibilities for compassion in situations designed to eliminate humanitarian sentiment. Their brief relationship, formed in the basement of a besieged hospital during one of history's most brutal conflicts, demonstrates that even the most comprehensive systems of ideological control cannot completely eliminate the human capacity for empathy and moral action. Dr. Petrov's decision to treat his enemy as a patient rather than a political category affirmed values that survive political changes and continue to influence medical practice long after the specific conflicts that tested them have ended. The preservation of their story serves not just as historical documentation, but as inspiration for future generations who may face similar challenges in defending humanitarian principles against political pressures that demand conformity over conscience. If this story moved you the same way it moved us, do us a favor, leave your like on this video. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about doctors who broke rules to save lives, soldiers who chose compassion over orders, ordinary people who risked everything for strangers they'd never see again. Real people. Real courage. Leave a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Germany, Russia, Canada, Australia. Our community spans the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in medicine or military service. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Dr. Mikhail Petrov and Hans Müller don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that possible. Educational note. This story is based on documented historical patterns and real events from the siege of Leningrad, combined with educational narrative elements for entertainment purposes. While individual names and specific details have been created for storytelling, the medical, political, and military circumstances described accurately reflect the historical realities faced by physicians and prisoners during this period of World War II.